Welcome, everyone. I'm Lynn Marsden Atlas. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here today. We have Elisabeth Berry Drago, who's going to speak to us today about gold making, painting, alchemy, and virtuosity in Dutch art. Welcome to the Arthur Ross Gallery's programs for our beautiful exhibition, An Inner World, 17th-century Dutch genre painting, which is currently on view at the Arthur Ross Gallery, and for which we have a very beautiful exhibition catalog, which you can purchase on site at the gallery when you come see the exhibition or through the University of Pennsylvania Press. So we'll do a promotion for that later. I'd also like to introduce Lara Yeager-Crasselt, who is his curator of the Leiden collection and also co-curator with Heather Muktaderi of this beautiful exhibition. Elisabeth Berry Drago is a research curator at the ScienceHistory Institute here in Philadelphia and co-host of the Institute's podcast on the odd and fascinating history of science, Distillations. She holds a PhD in art history from the University of Delaware, specializing in the representation of science and artisanal work, the history of the print, and artistic identity making. Her most recent book, Painted Alchemists, 2018, is the first on the painter Thomas Wicks, whose picture of alchemists in the laboratory offer new perspectives on early modern science and artistry. Lara Yeager-Crasselt is the curator of the Leiden collection and a specialist in 17th century Dutch and Flemish art. She earned her BA from Vassar College and a PhD in art history from the University of Maryland. At the Leiden collection, she oversees the scholarly research and exhibitions, including the collection's recent global exhibition tour in China, Russia, and the United Arab Emirates. And in 2020, she became co-editor of the Leiden Collection catalog. Previously, Lara held positions at the Sterling and Francine Clark Art Institute, the National Gallery of Art, Washington, D.C., and at KU Leuven, a Belgian-American educational foundation fellow. Most recently, she also served as an assistant professor at Vassar College. Yeager-Crasselt is the author of the book Michael Sweets, Shaping the Artist and the Academy in Rome and in Brussels, as well as numerous articles on the art of the Netherlands and Italy in the early modern period. So Elisabeth and Lara, thank you so much for being with us today. And Lara will be the moderator for our questions and answers immediately following Elisabeth's talk. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Lynn.
Oh, well, thank you, Lynn, for that introduction. Thank you, Lara, and to the Arthur Ross Gallery for having me. Can everyone hear me all right? And can everyone see my screen share? Great. So we'll begin with Jacob Tornfleet's Alchemist, which is part of this beautiful show, An Inner World. And painted about 1684, it's a study of texture and light, rich surfaces, anatomical detail, muscle and skin, cool metal, rumpled paper, wood, and shadow. The variety of textures and surfaces on display reminds us of the artist's virtuosic handling, his ability to differentiate the fine hairs of the alchemist's beard from the threads of his robe and the fur of his cap, in wisp-thin strokes and delicate touches of light, such as the shiny dab that forms a reflection on the assistant's thumbnail. That's one of my favorite details, is that beautiful thumbnail, actually. Tornfleet was the son of a Leiden painter, and later a pupil of the legendary Leiden feinschilder, or fine painter, Gerrit Douw, who was said to be so fastidious in his working methods that he obsessively prevented dust from falling on his unfinished pictures, lest it mar his microscopically fine brushstrokes and smooth finishes. Tornfleet's education obviously provided him with an eye for detail, and a keen sensitivity to the material properties of the objects, bodies, and spaces he intended to present. Dutch painting theory of the early modern period paid particular attention to the skill of differentiation and the representation of natural effects and natural light. The 17th century painter, poet, and art writer Samuel van Hoogstraten wrote that a perfect painting is like a mirror of nature, so rich with illusion and sensory detail that it could convince the eye of its own reality. His words echoed the earlier writers of painters and artists, the earlier writings of painters and artist biographers Karel van Mander, who in his Schilderbok, or Painter's Book of 1604, referred to skilled painting as reflexiekunst, or reflection art. By his explanation, light was nature's own artist, creating highlight and shadow, tone and depth as it was perceived by the human eye. This included not only direct light and directed shadow, but what he called spiegelen, or mirroring, describing the illusory effects of reflection on water, as we see here, which acts as a kind of natural self-portraiture, or a form of doubling. While nature originated these effects, van Mander believed painting perfected them, capturing light itself in a man-made version of reflexiekunst that combined visual mirroring with the most transformative effect of all, imagination. Van Mander believed these skills belonged particularly to Netherlandish artists, owing to an artistic heritage that stretched back to Jan van Eyck, a famed early master of naturalism, and according to artistic mythology, the inventor of oil painting. While Van Eyck may not have created the technique whole cloth, likely not, he was known as an innovator, and his work certainly popularized oil painting as the primary painting medium, shifting the preference of an entire generation away from the older technique of tempera painting, in which the medium was a quick-drying mix of water and egg. Van Eyck's pictures and oil painting more generally became desirable specifically for their quote-unquote glow, a perceived internal radiance that added luster to gold and jewels and real warmth and seeming blood to human skin tone. Dutch painters of Tornfleet's generation were still making use of Eyckian techniques, as oil paintings were typically created with multiple thin layers of oil glaze, one over the other, that allowed some of the underlayer's coloring to show through. Modern scientific analysis confirms that oil's radiant effects are assisted by the translucence of the oil itself, meaning that light can penetrate the upper layers of a painting and reflect off the bottom layers. By contrast, tempera is almost entirely opaque. Oil's translucence and this bounce of light off the lower layers of the painting means that oil pictures truly do, in a very physical sense, glow from within. So painters didn't just show the effects of light, they used light itself to build their masterpieces, manipulating and mimicking a natural process. This is probably a good time to note that in addition to being a painter par excellence and the father of oil painting, Jan van Eyck was also called an alchemist. Now, what is an alchemist? Some of us might instantly think of Harry Potter or Deborah Harkness's All Souls trilogy, or the manga Full Metal Alchemist, or any of the other fictional representations of alchemy circulating in pop culture. And all of the works I named do borrow in some way from the real history of alchemy to tell their stories. Alchemists have been depicted as deluded precursors to real chemists, who experimented with matter while lacking a full understanding of elemental building blocks. Alchemists are seen as aspiring gold makers, who wrongly believed lead could be transformed into more precious metals. They were seekers of the philosopher's stone, supposedly a chemical elixir that held the key to immortality. Dreamers, fools. So why would one of the most famed and admired painters in Netherlandish history have been called an alchemist? The short answer is because Jan van Eyck was known to perform experiments with different types of distilled oils and solvents to improve his craft. He was a bit of a creative chemical tinkerer as well as a painter. The slightly longer answer is that the early modern world saw alchemy quite differently than later generations have. Alchemy has always had its share of skeptics, but a vast portion of early modern people believed seriously in its possibilities, and for good reason. Alchemy created many useful things and ideas, from philosophies of internal medicine, to dyes and pigments, to distilled tonics and metal alloys. Basically, every essential chemical product of the period was manufactured by alchemical means, making alchemists, in a sense, the chemists, pharmacists, and metallurgists of the early modern world. If you're already interested in alchemy, you know already that alchemy's reputation for hucksterism and delusion was partly an invention of the Enlightenment in the 18th and 19th centuries, because there's nothing like the discovery of atoms and elements to make the lead into gold theory seem exceptionally ridiculous. So who is Tornfleet's alchemist? Is he a fraudulent gold maker hoping to cheat his next client? Is he a wise chemical physician looking for the elixir of life? A practical mineralogist examining a sample from a mine? To unpack his identity, today we'll look at how alchemists were typically represented in Netherlandish visual culture and how those representations align with the realities of period alchemical culture. Most histories of alchemy's visual culture begin with Peter Bruegel's Alchemist of about 1558. Engraved by Philip Scalay and published by Hieronymus Koch in Antwerp, the print portrays alchemy as a fool's endeavor that leads to poverty, chaos, and moral decay. This alchemist is a hardworking peasant, seated next to his stove, a common feature of the alchemical workshop. Alchemists needed high heat furnaces to melt metals and fuse chemical compounds, and alchemy is sometimes called the art of fire. Metals could be melted in small ceramic crucibles, sturdy vessels like the one that the alchemist is using here. We see him drop a round coin into it, suggesting that he's melting the family's real money in his experiments while dreaming of imaginary future riches. Behind him, his wife shows off their family's empty purse, while their children climb into an empty cupboard that should be filled with food and dry goods, but isn't. There's room for children, there's no grain. The alchemist's fire has consumed more than fuel. It's impoverishing his family, but he won't even turn from his work to witness the dire situation he's created. Notice that he faces away. In case this message could somehow be missed, Bruegel has also included the figures of a donkey-eared fool working a pair of bellows on the floor, and a figure who's been interpreted as an interlocutor or narrator. That's on the right side of the picture, gesturing at the family's destitute state over his books, as if to warn the viewer against following their example. Now, Bruegel was a towering figure in the history of Netherlandish painting, and it can't be overstated how big his influence is on the succeeding generations of Dutch and Flemish painters. And many Dutch painters of Tornfleet's era were still taking his works as important models. This is obvious in Adrian van de Venne's Rich Poverty of about 1661, which likewise shows a ragged alchemist mentally consumed by his own fire and crucible, while his wife and children bemoan their fate. Details of the alchemical equipment and tools, including the crucible and tongs, but also the long-necked alembics that you see to the right of the picture, to the right of the family group. These details confirm van de Venne's use of Bruegel as a model. However, it's worth noting that van de Venne has discarded the figures of the fool and the narrator with his books, and therefore made the scene a more intimate one. This is less a staged morality play than a private glimpse of a family in a moment of crisis. Another Dutch painter, Richard Brakenberg, shifted the composition, but kept the story of the failed alchemical patriarch intact in his Alchemist's Workshop with Children Playing of about 1680. This alchemist has 6 children, but still an empty cupboard. The alchemist's wife at center gestures towards her young son on the floor, who in this picture takes the place of Bruegel's fool, using a pair of bellows with a small brazier in imitation of his alchemist father. The sentimental tone of this work is underscored by the presence of a portrait of the Madonna and Child. It's a little difficult to see, but this is at the rear of the picture. I've lightened it slightly. The presence of this portrait, which is over the doorway to the left, as well as a crucifix at right placed on a high shelf. The contrast between the empty cupboard and the idealized depiction of Christian motherhood and the alchemist's neglect of his family makes the moral judgment of this picture quite straightforward. Popular Dutch literature echoed the attitude of these pictures and mocked alchemists for their own self-impoverishment. Jacob Cats was one of the 17th century Netherlands' most popular poets. Indeed, he is one of the most famous and popular Dutch poets of all time. And he was beloved for his humorous satirical verses. His emblem books paired moralizing but witty texts with brain teaser images like this one. By reading the verse and studying the image at once, the full moral can be discovered. In his hugely popular 1618 emblem book, Katz wrote about an alchemist under the emblem fugat non capit, meaning it escapes, it cannot be. This is a scene of prey eluding a hunter. Katz referred to alchemists as, quote, seekers of the arts, but finders of the beggar's purse, unquote. And he wrote, the alchemist, it's true, has discovered many good things for us, but who becomes rich from the profits that he makes? He blows and rages all the time through his dusty kitchen. Even if it's smoked day and night, gives nothing but dirty smells. The man burns his pants, the woman blows away her bodice. Someone else has the benefit, and he the empty wallet. Not too positive, but there is an alternative pictorial tradition for alchemy and alchemists. Not every 16th or 17th century representation of an alchemist was a judgmental or a moralizing one. We can contrast Bruegel's engraving with another engraving produced barely a few decades later, also engraved by Philip Scallet and also published in Antwerp, titled Distillatio or Distillation. The design was created by Johannes Stradanus, or Jan van der Straat, as part of a series called the Nova Reperta, New Inventions, showcasing some of the technological wonders of the 16th century. These ranged from the printing press and eyeglasses to cannons and new medical treatments for syphilis. But distillation also had its pride of place here. The alchemical art of distillation was designed to reduce substance to essence. It's the same process that's used today to make everything from distilled water to gin, to essential oils, and so on and so on. At the most basic level, it involves heating a sealed vessel of liquid and capturing the droplets that condense on the surface of the vessel. The long-necked alembics you see in the center were designed to allow steam to condense and then run down the neck into a second vessel or receiver. This distillation workshop is no peasant's rundown shack. This is a busy and prosperous enterprise with an enormous staff, a cavernous space to work in, and even a painting hanging on the left side of the room. So I wouldn't keep a painting next to a distillation furnace, but that's the conservator talking. The alchemist who supervises this workshop wears a scholar's cap and gown. He's at left, an assistant is reading over his shoulder. Now, this fellow is every inch the respectable shopmaster and expert. Dutch and Flemish artists drew on Stradanus's designs as well as Bruegel's. So they looked to this picture pretty much as they looked to Bruegel's picture for examples. The workshop of the Flemish painter, David Teniers the Younger, who served as court painter to the Archduke of Austria, is known to have produced over 300 scenes of alchemical workrooms, ranging from the humble to the magnificent. His Alchemist of about 1660 shows a massive and presumably prosperous laboratory staffed by assistants and laborers. Teniers' unusually young alchemist sits at the foreground with a pair of bellows, gazing out at the viewer as if to invite comment. The workshop shows a dizzying array of glass, ceramic, and metal vessels, from cooling basins to copper stills, earthenware storage jugs, and delicate glass apparatuses. There's evidence of a wide variety of alchemical processes at work here, from distillation in the right foreground, showcased by the long-necked vessels attached to the spigot, just over that adorable little dog, to metalworking at the rear center, shown by the presence of the anvil beside a small forge. But there are also signs of interest in medicine. To the far back, we see three men engaged in conversation over glass distilling vessels. One grinds with a large mortar and pestle, while the other holds up a clear flask with a stopper, pointing to an open book on the table before him. This vignette, the man holding a flask in close proximity to other distillation vessels, appears over and over in similar scenes of alchemists, as well as scenes of physicians and pharmacists, and represents the popular practice of urinoscopy, or diagnosis via the examination of urine. It was widely believed that numerous diseases could be diagnosed through urinoscopy, as later medical science actually confirmed in the case of studies of diabetes, kidney infections, and so on. So, rather than representing a real alchemical workshop, Teniers' scene represents an expansive view of alchemy itself. So capturing many of the diverse practices, experiments, and desires that contributed to a greater body of chemical knowledge. Incidentally, Jacob Tornfleet also depicted uronoscopy in his doctor's visit of about 1667. Here, the physician examines the flask while simultaneously taking the patient's pulse. The patient is a young woman, likely intended to represent love sickness. While images like these were often satirical, playing a swooning young lover off of a lecherous or comic doctor, Tornfleet's doctor is dressed as a respectable physician, and his face exhibits a calm contemplation of the flask rather than a winking look at the audience. Now, traditional medicine was derived from herbal remedies, chamomile for stings or burns, onions and parsley as diuretics, poppy for pain, and so on. But alchemists proposed new theories of chemical medicine, targeted drugs that could attack disease within the body, rather than treating disease by rebalancing the body's humors. Many of their medicines did not succeed, particularly those that involved ingested mercury. But the alchemists' work in targeted medicine was the precursor to modern pharmaceuticals. And believe it or not, their theories of ingesting small doses of toxic materials to cure disease contributed significantly to the development of chemotherapy. Perhaps the best illustration of the paradox of alchemy in art and literature is an engraved illustration from Christoph Weigel's 1698 Book of Trades, which included over 200 images of artists and tradesmen, including this image of two alchemists titled The Alchemist and the Gold Maker. Now, those may seem like the exact same thing, but Weigel intended those two terms to be distinct and opposing rather than repetitive, as his epigram later makes clear. As he writes below the image, such artifice is necessary to prepare medicines and to help nature. But when you seek gold alone, so will vanish with the smoke honor, laughter, money, and mercury. So this separation between practical alchemy, which delivered useful drugs, dyes, and pigments and other things to the market, and gold making, this distinction was well understood, meaning alchemists could be mocked in print or verse even while their useful products were being widely consumed. Alchemy was such a popular subject in art because it was a source and object of so much curiosity in daily life. People from all backgrounds interacted with it in some way, whether they were workers, scholars, or from the ranks of the wealthy and powerful. In Dutch cities like Haarlem and Leiden, cloth dyers and bleachers made use of chemical knowledge in preparations of acids, dye baths, fixatives, and color enhancers. The link between the textile trade and alchemy is visualized here in this illustration from the Splendor Solis, or Splendor of the Sun, a 16th century illuminated manuscript containing allegorical images related to alchemical laboratory processes. Each page of the Splendor Solis allegorized a step in the making of the philosopher's stone, that is, represented it in a veiled way through visual metaphor. I want to make a distinction here that just because alchemists were not actually able to create the quote-unquote philosopher's stone that purified all matter and extended human life, that doesn't mean that the processes they used in pursuit of it were not very real. This image of washing and bleaching also refers to the way that raw materials needed to be washed or separated by alchemists before use. Raw ores that were extracted from mines were usually a mix of minerals, dirt, metals, and particulate of all kinds. So part of the alchemist's task was to separate and refine these so their unique properties could be studied and tested, and so that each material could be used to its best effect. Mining experts and mineralogists used alchemy in their daily work, even though some were skeptical of alchemy's more theoretical aspects. Georgius Agricola, known to his friends as Georg Bauer, was a German mining expert and the author of the widely used treatise De Re Metallica on the nature of metals, published in 1556. His book condemned would-be gold makers as frauds and charlatans, but in the same breath, he praised alchemists for their skills in manipulating metal. He also believed in the theory of metallic generation, meaning that metals grow within the earth similar to the way that organic life grows on the surface. Not accurate, but also not too crazy when you consider that most metals are found in their natural state in mixed proportions. Looking at a vein of copper that's mingled with silver with silver particles could easily convince you that the copper was slowly changing state over time to become its more precious cousin. This metal generation theory was entirely alchemical in nature, and Agricola's work shows us that even the skeptics had to grudgingly admit alchemists had some pretty great ideas. Alchemy was also popular with scholars and intellectuals who translated ancient Greek texts on chemical philosophy by Zosimos and natural philosophical works by Aristotle, Galen, and others. Alchemy was also of interest to physicians, and the famed Swiss doctor Paracelsus became one of the 16th century's greatest and most controversial medical crusaders for his belief in chemistry-based pharmaceuticals. Here in Leiden, alchemy was studied by prominent university scholars such as Johannes Hernius, a professor of medicine and a pioneer in the practice of bedside medical teaching. In addition to his medical writings, the professor penned an introduction to the edition of the Secreta Alchemia, an alchemical treatise attributed to the theologian and philosopher Thomas Aquinas. And here at the left is our friend Johannes, the Leiden professor of medicine. Leiden's university was a particularly important center for the study of alchemy and chemistry. In the mid-17th century, during Tornfleet's lifetime, the professor of medicine Franciscus Silvius established the first, this is not Silvius, this is our friend Bolarhava. We'll get to him in just a minute. But the professor of medicine Franciscus Silvius established the first equipped chemical laboratory at Leiden University, or indeed at any Dutch university, showing you how important Leiden was to this movement. His goal was to better integrate the studies of chemistry and medicine. And Leiden's next generation after Silvius would produce one of history's most influential chemical teachers, Hermann Bolarhava, our friend right here. He was born in 1668, and he would have been a teenager when Tornflate's Alchemist was painted. And he was hired by the university as a lecturer in medicine and chemistry by 1701, where he innovated laboratory-based teaching and encouraged his students to pursue both practical and theoretical studies of chemistry, feeling that these are essentially intertwined. Even after retirement, he performed alchemical experiments and continued to study the possibility of gold making, which he was curious but skeptical about, while his class lecture notes formed one of the first ever university textbooks in chemistry. Bolarhava did not see alchemy as only the foolish pursuit of gold, but understood it as a set of tools by which to investigate matter. In his Elementa Chemie, or Elements of Chemistry, he writes that he has, quote, never met any writers on natural philosophy who treat the nature of bodies and the manner of changing them so profoundly or explain them so clearly as those called alchemists, unquote. Alchemists were sometimes represented as scholars, as in this picture by Thomas Vijk, a Haarlem painter slightly younger than Tornfleet. Painted around 1650, this small atmospheric picture of a scholar at his writing desk evokes the intellectual side of alchemy, the long days of study required to master its complex theories. Alchemical knowledge was sometimes referred to as secrets, as in books of secrets, a popular term for collections of alchemical recipes. Texts circulated under names such as the De Secreti and the Liber de Secretis. The term secret had a twofold meaning. One, it referred to the idea of revealed truth, divine wisdom or lost ancient secret knowledge, things that could only be revealed to the hardworking, the honest, the trustworthy, and faithful. But it also had a much more practical sense. Alchemists protected their proprietary trade secrets the same way that a brewer might protect his best recipe, or a goldsmith would protect the secret method of polishing metal to a shine. Alchemy was, in this sense, another inner world that required hard study and initiation into mystery to enter. And artists understood these ideas very well. Alchemy shares a long history with art and struggles with some of the same driving questions regarding the mastery of nature, which is demonstrated to us in their use of Reflexikunst and the use of light. The transformation, artists and alchemists both explore the transformation of substance into essence, the line between mimicry and true creation. Like artists, alchemists labored with both hand and mind, joining creativity to technical skill. Both recognized the importance of privacy to their work for a whole host of reasons, protection against competition in terms of maintaining their studio's special techniques or designs, protection against interruption, whether from domestic life or the demands of clients and patrons, and the need for space and solitude to nurture their creative and contemplative habits. And here with Thomas Vijk's Alchemist, we see Rembrandt's painter in his studio, another incredibly reflective, solitary, secret picture. The art theorist Samuel van Hoogstraten, in his 1678 treatise, The Introduction to the Academy of Painting, called painting, quote, a sister of reflective philosophy, unquote. He writes that the practice of the noble arts, in silent, observant pursuit of the secrets of nature, corresponds and runs parallel to the exercise of the virtues, unquote. His advice echoed the writings of alchemists, such as the Italian mystical alchemist Flavio Girolamo, who wrote that isolation was necessary for creative workers to, quote unquote, escape distraction and conceal lofty things in the mind, unquote. Now, craft workers, scholars, physicians, and artists, that's a pretty broad stretch of society, but they're not the only ones excited by alchemy. Nobles in European courts from Brussels to Prague are also fascinated with alchemy, mainly in the hope that it can enrich their lands and fund their militaries. Gold, silver, and copper mines are typically owned by the nobility, and so many nobles retained alchemists to help increase the yield. The Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II, at left here, patronized a dizzying array of alchemists, artists, occultists, and spiritualists. One of his most famous hires was, at right, John Dee, the former personal astrologer of Queen Elizabeth I, who claimed he could use a crystal to communicate with angels and receive divine instructions on transmuting gold. So Rudolph II was very eager to try almost anything. The English King Charles II also patronized alchemy extensively, not only kept a round-the-clock chemical physician, but a royal alchemist at his beck and call, as well as building a set of laboratories near the Royal Palace in London. Charles II is probably most famous within the history of science for acting as the patron of the Royal Society, technically titled the Royal Society of London for Improving Natural Knowledge. It was founded by King's Charter in 1660. With the support of the English crown, the Royal Society became a center for scientific investigation, and alchemy featured in some of its hottest debates, with members split between belief and disbelief. Discussions of gold making were banned on and off over the years, but many other experiments, especially in medicine and metallurgy, drew crowds of interested, science-curious patrons. Now, alchemical demonstrations, that is, public demonstrations or demonstrations for a member of the nobility or for the court, these are all the vogue in the 17th century, particularly when alchemists can show off the more spectacular effects of chemical change. One famous experiment, which supposedly created dragon's blood, involved dissolving and redissolving gold with reactive agents in a sealed vessel until it volatilized or became reactive itself. When this happened and the gold became a form of gold chloride, a spectacular color change would turn the gold metal, bright red, hence the term dragon's blood. Evidence of this work appears in the 12 Keys of Basil Valentine, a popular and often reprinted set of alchemical emblems first published in the 1590s. Basil Valentine was likely a pseudonym for the German alchemist Johann Tolde, who was employed across Germany in various mining operations for most of his life. This is one of the keys. This is the third key shown here from the 12 Keys of Basil Valentine. And the keys are really steps in alchemical processes, much like the Splendor Solis, an allegorized visual metaphor explaining a real laboratory technique. The purpose of the book was both to reveal and conceal the process, to reveal it to the initiated who had studied the work before, and to conceal it from people who did not yet understand the symbolism. Like in Jakob Katz's popular emblem books, the reader could eventually decipher the meaning by reading the text and studying the image together. But in this case, they would only succeed if they were already well-versed in alchemical terms and symbols. Here we see the dragon, representing the finished dragon's blood, and behind it, a wild attack between a wolf and two roosters. How to interpret this? Well, as the wolf bites one rooster, it's bitten in turn by another. This is a reference to the circular way that the gold should be dissolved and then redissolved in the same vessel again until it, quote unquote, devours itself and performs that dramatic color shift. So alchemical knowledge, as we've seen, is powerful. It can even be dangerous, as the alchemist Georg Honauer discovered in 1597. Honauer had promised Duke Friedrich of Württemberg that for a hefty fee, he could transmute an enormous quantity of the Duke's iron into gold. But when his experiments failed, he fled town in the night and was hunted down. Honauer was actually executed for breaking his contract. I find this curious that he was not executed for making false promises about alchemy, because the Duke continued to believe in alchemy. He was only executed for breaking his contract because the Duke believed he was just withholding his secret knowledge. So Honauer was executed on a massive iron gallows, pictured here in a broadsheet from the execution. And yes, the gallows were built out of the iron that he'd failed to transmute. At least 3 more failed alchemists met their fate on the exact same way in the exact same gallows within the following decade. So, as you can imagine, alchemists were extremely concerned about the idea of fraud and extremely concerned with bolstering alchemy's reputation. Alchemists often referenced frauds and cheats in their writing as warnings to prospective clients and as a shield against accusation of fraud for themselves. The 16th century German physician and alchemist Heinrich Kunrath penned a treatise with the following very direct, explicit title. This is the title, I'll read it in full. Quote, "Heartfelt warning and admonition from a faithful devotee of the truth to all true enthusiasts of the natural transmutational alchemy, which necessitates close attention because of the roguish tricks of the wicked chemists," unquote. Within this treatise, he lists no less than 46 different types of tricks and cheats used by false alchemists, including hollow stirring rods plugged with wax that could melt ingredients into a bowl, double-bottom vessels, bogus glassware, and so on. Kunrath didn't mince words. He said that alchemists who intentionally cheated customers and therefore made life more difficult for real alchemists were evil. And he said, quote, "Everyone who sees one should spit at him," unquote. Kunrath had a lot of thoughts about the evil alchemists and the ideal alchemists. On the right, you see an ideal laboratory design that was part of one of his treatises. So a dreamer, an idealist, Kunrath is many things, a performer. At the same time as alchemists advertised their honesty, they also worked to keep their most vital knowledge under that cloak of secrecy. The keys of Basil Valentine, as we've seen, demonstrate the veiled allegorical way that they transmitted information visually, and their collected books of secrets only revealed lessons to the well-studied. That said, there are some alchemists who are more interested in revealing their processes than others. There is at least one alchemist who even made use, I'm sorry, this is Books of Secrets. Books of Secrets keep things, this is where the National Treasure got that idea from the real alchemical Books of Secrets. I won't make you look at this for very long. So some alchemists are more interested in revealing secrets than others. There is even one alchemist who made use of popular imagery to convey his meaning. And this is the well-traveled alchemist and bergwerker, literally mountain worker, Goosen van Vrieswijk. Van Vrieswijk was a mining expert who worked across the Netherlands, Germany, Sweden, England, and even Suriname and Canada. Well-traveled indeed. Especially for his time. In less than 20 years, Van Vrieswijk published 9 books on alchemy, many of them illustrated by emblems that he did not initiate, but actually pulled from the design of another emblem bookmaker. And I'm sure you can guess this by now. It was Jacob Cats. Van Vrieswijk's work had esoteric allegorical titles like The Red Lion and The Green Lion and The Silver River or King's Fountain, which is part of this show. Van Vrieswijk was heavily inspired by the works of Basil Valentine and likely gained inspiration for his emblems from Valentine's keys. His own writing, though, was highly descriptive and practical. And although he relied on symbol and metaphor in his imagery, his text mainly included instructions for step-by-step processes in the laboratory, details of how to construct and operate mining equipment, and accounts of his own travels and experiments. Here we see an illustration from Jakob Katz on the left. The spiderweb on the left is from Jakob Katz. The spiderweb on the right is from a 1675 printing of Van Frieswick's Cabinet of Minerals, or the Golden Sun of the Philosophers. So as you can see, Van Frieswick directly borrows Katz's image of spiders and flies caught in a web from an emblem whose message boils down to, so on the left, the original emblem by Jakob Katz, non intrandum, aut penetrandum. The meaning of this boils down to, it's easier to get in than to get out. Or if you don't know the game, stay away from it. So this is a warning against vice and gambling and other habits that are easy to start and hard to break. So Van Frieswick has taken this picture and added the alchemical symbol for Mercury in center, just directly below the spider. You can see that at right, just below the spider, the symbol for Mercury. He's also added symbols at the bottom along the step in order. They are niter, tartar, niter again, salt, and sal ammoniac. So by reading the symbols and the image at once, the alchemy-inclined reader might deduce that this represents the fixation of mercury, a means to change the state of its otherwise volatile liquid form. So the point of this, the point of the niter, tartar, salt, sal ammoniac is to fix mercury as a chemical salt rather than its own original formulation. By borrowing the emblem's original message of entrapment, holding, confinement, Van Frieswick uses the popular meaning to help convey the secret meaning. This is very rare. Another important note here is that Van Frieswick typically wrote in vernacular Dutch rather than in the elevated Latin of the universities and scholarly publishers. His use of language and his use of Katz's popular, famous, well-known illustrations indicates that Van Frieswick's primary audience was people like himself. Skilled and educated individuals, yes, but individuals whose primary interest in alchemy was job and craft-based, who needed useful sources for their work. By marrying a Dutch language text to wildly popular and familiar Dutch emblems, Van Frieswick shifted alchemy's secret symbolic mode into a more accessible and familiar form. Truly a unique fellow. These are just a few more of the illustrations. So these are all emblems that are drawn from Jakob Katz's work and adopted by Van Frieswick. You can see the alchemical symbols are added. So these are really, he would walk the viewer through the image and walk them through the process step by step so that they can understand the relationship of the alchemical symbols to the emblematic theme. So returning at last to Tornfleet's Alchemist, we are now more qualified to make our analysis. Is he a serious practitioner engaged in improving the products of nature? Is he a fraud? Is he a victim of self-delusion like Bruegel's peasant? Perhaps we can best observe by contrast, as Tornfleet did paint at least one other alchemist, this one dating about 5 years earlier, which you see on the right. Tornfleet's first alchemist, at right, sits alone at a notched stone bench, studying his small coal fire and the crucible that rests over it. He appears to have just been reading from a rumpled page in his folio. The paper is creased and torn, suggesting either this is one of many times he's attempted this experiment, or the page has traveled through many prior hands. With a small piece of chalk, he has been using the stone bench as a writing slate, checking his work with tally marks and scrawling symbols, perhaps to interpret the text's allegorized instructions. His physiognomy and dress are similar to Tornfleet's second alchemist, with his beard, brow wrinkles, and furred cap. But his dress is humbler, without the iridescent appeal of the fur-trimmed lilac silk robe. He's also alone. No assistants appeal for his guidance or support his work. We can guess then which alchemist of these two has the funds to support a staff. Perhaps the most important difference lies in what tools sit before them. The crucible on one hand, and the mortar and pestle in the other. As we've seen, the crucible is often associated visually with gold making. the most discredited aspect of all alchemical work. Mortars and pestles appear in a much wider variety of contexts, but are often linked to distillation and therefore to medicine. They were used in almost every alchemical context, but their visual association with medicine and distilling was strong. So perhaps what Tornfleet has given us is not merely two alchemists, but one alchemist and one gold maker, as if in an echo of the division once presented by Weigel's emblem. A painting like Tornfleet's, however, serves a very different purpose from a memorializing album, even if they share some aspects from being part of the same greater visual culture. Moralizing emblems were designed to convey a set and specific meaning. So here's our Weigel emblem again, our alchemist and gold maker, question mark. Dutch paintings might contain a moral message, but in essence, they're greater than the sum of their parts. They function differently than an emblem does, with that teasing play of word and image together. Dutch paintings perform multiple functions at once: conversation piece, decoration, visual record, stimulus to imagination, invitation to the senses, and of course, as luminous and glowing mirrors of nature. Their meaning was rarely fixed, and part of the pleasure of examining them was to find multiple, even competing interpretations, and then probably to argue over which was right. We know that Dutch collectors praised paintings that were subtle and complex, that did not yield all their secrets at first glance. While Tornfleet's later alchemist is accompanied by the prominent mortar and pestle, visually linking him to medicine, his assistant also holds up a metallic or mineral sample on a small slate for his review. Could this be gold? There are other stones on the table before him, particularly the prominent red stone sitting at the foreground of the table. Alchemists sought stones like these, and the red or rubedo stone was associated with a key step in the attainment of the philosopher's stone or universal elixir. The red stone was supposedly achieved through a fusion of sulfur and mercury under high heat and pressure. Was the rubedo stone real? Well, we do know what happens when sulfur and mercury are fused under high heat and pressure. This is the same process that produces one of the most common pigments in the early modern painter's toolkit, vermilion. Dutch pigment makers' books confirm that the same types of vessels and furnaces were used to manufacture vermilion pigment as were used to attempt making the philosopher's stone. Now, while artists did not necessarily see their pigments as alchemical, it's striking to realize that Tornfleet has likely used an alchemical product to depict his alchemical scene. If alchemy's goal was to master the secrets of nature, and now the painter has mastered the work of alchemy, in a sense, the painter has surpassed the alchemist by using light, linen oil, and rubedo stone to create his convincing illusion of life. For an alchemy-curious viewer, this back and forth play between stone and painter, canvas and laboratory, illusion and reality could have provided an endless source of curiosity and conversation, no less fascinating than any alchemical treatise cloaked in mystery and metaphor, ready to be deciphered. Tornfleet's alchemist is therefore neither simply a good one or a bad one. He is a fascinating one, and that is the best kind of all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for that wonderful, rich, illuminating talk, which has given, I'm sure, all of us lots to think about. I just want to remind everyone to please, we have a few questions. I have a few thoughts I want to kind of get us started with, but please put your Q&A in the chat and I will get to those in just a moment. So I'm always amazed how ubiquitous alchemy was in the early modern world. And at some point, everyone benefited from it, interacted with it, engaged with it, questioned it, mocked it, admired it. I mean, this rich, just kind of competing ideas and perceptions of what it was. And I think in the context of the exhibition, of thinking about the inner world, I love how you've talked about this idea also of secrecy, and how both in the paintings themselves, but then in the treatises and the texts, this idea of how that knowledge was conveyed in the space of the Alchemist Workshop, but that there was this element of solitude to that, of that secrecy, which brings you into that inner world, but at the same time, it's very much used in the outer world, right? That this kind of dichotomy that exists between the two. And one question which relates to a question that Lloyd DeWitt has shared too, So with Tornfleet's painting, what struck me as well was how close he brings the viewer to the two alchemists, or even to the single alchemist, right? That we've kind of come into this intimate space and looking at the painting as viewers, which is very different than Peter Bruegel's or David Teniers, right? Where we have these large spaces and we see the kind of cavernous ceilings and all the tools and instruments of the trade. So it allows us almost more room for contemplation in how we're looking at these paintings. So I was wondering if you could kind of comment on that, if that Tornfleet's approach has anything to do with, that we're at the end of the 17th century at this point. And just to come back to Lloyd's question, which kind of follows up from that, do you think it's fair to see Teniers as carrying on a theatrical tradition of Bruegel? So kind of looking at the beginning and then the end of the century.
Yeah, I think number one, Lloyd, yes. I definitely see Teniers as carrying on the more theatrical tradition. Bruegel's pictures are more like stage sets or morality plays. There's all the moving pieces and all the moving parts, and there's sort of different movements to it. In the tradition of those the early Netherlandish painters who are painting scenes where the entire story unfolds in one frame. Narrative art that has, that they would do versions of the journey of Christ to the cross, and it would be like every stop was depicted on like a long road. And Bruegel is obviously responding to some of those things by including all these various elements. And then Teniers is absolutely responding to Bruegel by having, his Alchemist Workshops. He does do some more intimate pictures of alchemists, but his workshops are typically enormous. And they have these many movements or aspects or different views, different vignettes. So you have the medical vignette, you have the metallurgical vignette, you have the alchemist in the foreground. There's all these little plays happening in the same picture. So yes, I definitely think I think Teniers is really responding to that theatrical performative side of Bruegel. But a picture like Tornfleet's, it makes me think of something closer to, Michael Fried's absorption and theatricality, that idea that, someone absorbed in their subject is absorbing you, the viewer, in turn, that it's their, it's that contemplation. You wouldn't think that contemplation is such a fascinating subject to look at, but it is. Someone deeply in thought, studying a text, studying the rubedo stone, et cetera, is very absorbing and very fascinating. And you're invited to, and to think about what they're contemplating. You're invited to contemplate, the object of their contemplation and come up with alternative views. And I find it interesting because Tornfleet's frame is so close. The cropping, and I'm almost duplicating it here, but the cropping is so close, and that's I find that to be much more rare in alchemical pictures, because alchemical pictures are usually interested in giving you the debris. They want to give you the furnaces, the different fires, the different kinds of glassware, because often these alchemical pictures are showing off the artist's virtuosity. That it's all about, I can paint glass, I can paint stone, I can paint powder, I can paint copper, I can paint, distilling vessels, I can paint fire and smoke and ephemeral effects. They're showcases of the whole range of talent. So Tornfleet's more intimate picture to me is definitely more contemplative. It's more, it's less prescribed. It's hard to understand at first glance whether this is this positive, is this negative? And I think those questions are actually beside the point, because it is about the contemplation and the process and the intimacy of being drawn into this secret world.
Right. I think it's interesting too that both of the paintings you showed by Tornfleet were executed on copper.
Yes.
Kind of adds this whole other, element to his making, but also the viewer's observation of these paintings.
There's a preciousness to them. There's a real preciousness to them as well. I mean, both literally and figuratively.
Exactly. And they're small scale paintings. So that's part of that experience of how you engage with them. Is really meant to be intimate. We have a question from Ronnie Bear. The Tornfleet was influenced by Dow's approach to picture making as well. Is that right?
Yes. There's a thought that Tornflate is Dow's student. And I think that I think the intimacy and the fineness, I don't know that, I don't think Dow ever painted any alchemists that I'm aware of, but he painted a lot of scholars, and was known was known for his approaches to scholarship and figuring the painter as a scholar. And so I think you could put the alchemist into conversation with all those other pictures. I would put his alchemist, and I would put Tornfleet's alchemist into conversation with Dou's scholars and Dou's painters, looking at the intimacy with which you step into the studio or into the laboratory, certainly.
Right, and even the fur-trimmed robe and all of these elements.
Oh yeah,
repeated.
Yeah, I think the physiognomies, the clothing, they're all sort of pieces of the puzzle.
These elements. So there's another question back to Teniers. Teniers paints numerous images of alchemists, seemingly of both kinds, both types. Do you have a notion of how the subject fits in with other works that Teniers made, such as his tavern scenes or his witchcraft scenes?
So one thing that I always have to remember about Teniers is how big his production is. He leads, so as opposed to someone like Thomas Weick, who paints a lot of alchemists, but really Thomas Weick paints about 40 alchemists and there's really only one of him. So it's a pretty high ratio of one person to output. Teniers has this massive enterprise, and so there's simply so many subjects that he produces, that they produce. Anything that's popular, anything that's interesting to him, which is a really wide variety of things, including witchcraft, taverns, peasant scenes. He picks up all of Bruegel's kind of peasant revelry stuff. What I often relate his alchemical pictures to are his scenes of his singeries, his apes of nature, where he paints. He produces images of artists as apes or monkeys, and he produces images of alchemists as apes or monkeys. And it's that curious thinking around mimicking nature or aping nature, copying nature, learning from nature in a really playful way. And both alchemists and artists, he makes fun of alchemy and art in exactly the same way. To me, there's that fascinating through line where he's like, artists, the apes of nature. And then he turns around and is like, alchemists, the apes of nature. And Teniers famously paints himself. I don't know, I haven't done enough work on the provenance of this picture or where it originates from, but there's at least one believed Teniers self-portrait as an alchemist, where he's standing in front of a curtain and the kind of workshop is unfolding behind him. It's a likeness similar to his other self-reflective pictures. And I think that's so striking that Teniers would associate himself closely with alchemy. Of all the subjects, he doesn't, to my knowledge, he doesn't paint himself as a brawling peasant or as a baker. I think there's a relationship there. I think it's something that he's interested in. I don't know if he's interested in it from, a philosopher's stone kind of way, but I think he's interested in a creativity, in a workshop sense.
Yeah, it's super fascinating. So as a question, I want to actually just bring it back for a moment, back to the context. And you talked about Leiden as a university city and as a place where the practice and study of alchemy, in fact, was at some point really almost codified into university teachings. And there's a question, sort of a follow-up to that, which is, would most or all of the artists in the Inner World exhibition have shared the same views or have the same knowledge of alchemy as Tornfleet? My first reaction to that is just probably not. But about Leiden, I think it's interesting that Tornfleet was, raised and educated and first trained in Leiden, and then he went off. Actually, he was spent time in Vienna and Rome before coming back. And this painting that we've been talking about was probably executed in Amsterdam. But this context of Leiden and the university is so important for the show. But in general, you mentioned Franziska Silvius, who had studied at Leiden, who was a professor of medicine at Leiden. We know that he actually had furnaces or rooms for alchemical investigations in his house. And he was also a significant collector of the work of artists like Gerard Dow and Franz von Mieris. I don't know if Tornfleet. So can you talk a bit about maybe this sort of context in Leiden, the kind of knowledge that other artists may have had, and how that may intersect then with the interest, who was collecting these paintings besides at the courts in this sort of royal context?
So to think a little bit about the Leiden context, Well, first of all, I think if you got 10 alchemists in a room, you wouldn't get the same opinion of alchemy. So I think putting 10 artists in the room, you would get a really wide opinion on alchemy. I think there are some artists who are really keenly aware that their work borders on it. And I think there are other artists who may be interested in it as a popular subject to paint, but are not interested in the deeper aspects. And I think that's really common, and it goes across, there are physicians who are working in chemical medicine who are like, gold making is fake and I never want to talk about it. You get 10 members of the Royal Society into the room and the opinions on alchemy would be very mixed at any point. I'm reminded of, how contentious science and medicine topics are today amongst, educated audiences, amongst curious audiences who are, who come from very different places in how they approach things. So I think those, the debates rage on about chemistry. But so Leiden, I think Leiden is such a center for chemistry in Tornfleet's lifetime specifically. Leiden is such a center for chemistry that it has an international impact. Sylvius is internationally renowned. Bolarhava is internationally renowned. So I think it's possible that even as Tornfleet is moving to these other places, if he's at all interested in chemistry, if he's at all interested in any of these questions, if he's just interested in the the kind of reputation of his city in terms of natural philosophy and curiosity and sort of empirical work, which is the hot topic in Europe in this era, then I think that legacy would be easy to find wherever he went, because what's happening in Leiden is partly shaping the chemistry that's unfolding across Europe at this time. I hope that got to some of it. Oh, in terms of who's collecting, so a lot of Dutch artists are, a lot of the folks that I have investigated. So I've investigated most deeply Thomas Vijk, because I think that his work is so closely tied to a deeper understanding of alchemy as a creative transformative process. And looking at his career gives one example where he paints an alchemist when he's in Haarlem. There's a tradition. His teacher paints a couple of alchemists. He paints a few alchemists. Really, everyone in his Haarlem circle, Bega, Van Ostera, like all these folks in his sort of network they've all painted at least a couple of alchemists. The fact that he goes on and paints alchemists throughout his career is to me more striking. Right. But alchemy is a subject that's circulated through this group. And then he goes over to work for the personal circles of Charles II. And this is in England, alchemy is all the vogue with the Restoration, Charles II bringing in sort of building the laboratories and doing the same sort of thing. So he paints for the court. It's highly collected in the courts. And so, of course, like we know there's this association between, Rudolph II collects images of alchemists. Charles II collects images of alchemists. These patrons of alchemists themselves, noble patrons of alchemy, are collecting alchemical pictures. But we also know that people who are associated with alchemy at a much more mundane, sort of domestic vernacular level. So people who work in chemical medicine, people who work in metallurgy and things like that, they might have pictures of Vulcan and pictures of alchemists. So they have the kind of mythological aspect of their work, and they have the sort of practical outlet for their work. So there is an audience. This is, it's hard to track unless you go through like every inventory of a goldsmith, every estate sale from a goldsmith's posthumous estate sale, for 100 years. But there is an association. So alchemy is just a popular subject in general, as are painting, peasant brawls and singeries and things like that. But there is an association between interest in alchemy and collection of pictures around alchemy, both at, I think, a really high elite level and at the vernacular level.
Which is fascinating that it reaches that wide of an audience.
It's, as you said, it's ubiquitous. I mean, alchemy is everywhere.
Yeah, it really truly is. I know that we're running low on time, but at least I want to get to one more question, which is really interesting one again by Lloyd, which is, have you encountered any women alchemists besides the famous Anna Zieglerin?
Yes. Marie Merdrac is a French woman alchemist who actually writes a chemistry textbook on for women. She writes essentially a chemical workbook specifically for women to educate more women into chemistry. There's Margaret Cavendish, Mad Madge, who is her sort of elite education allows her to pursue topics in alchemy that were really off limits to other women. I would encourage folks. I know we have a limited amount of time, but I encourage everybody to go to the Science History Institute websites. We have tried to do a lot more work on women chemists, women alchemists, and things like that. And so, but those are two off the top of my head who I'm very fond of.
Okay, I think I want to just get one, which maybe is a quicker question, maybe not. It was an early
Lloyd,
one.
email me.
An early one from Heather, and maybe we'll leave that as the last question. In terms of dress and costume, we have a emblem book by Ripa in the exhibition as well, showing an alchemist who's in the studio actually with a swan headdress on. And if you could comment at all upon that, or the sense of what alchemists may have been wearing.
A swan. I wonder if that's like an Ovidian reference, because there's a strong and widely understood relationship between Ovid, the Metamorphosis, alchemy, and art. So I'm wondering if there's something to that, because the Metamorphosis is all about transformation, shape changing, allegory. There are actual Michael Meyer and a few other notable alchemists actually do sort of glosses on the Metamorphosis. They write responses to Ovid. They say that some of Ovid's imagery is actually secretly veiled alchemy instructions and things like that. And like that's pretty much, no one thinks that's true anymore, but the alchemists were very excited by those ideas. And I think that well understood relationship between Ovid, the Metamorphosis, alchemy, and art might spur the swan headdress. That would be my best guess, is that spurring the swan headdress. Usually you see them in those robes japonaises that the scholars are wearing. You see the fur cap and the scholarly robes and things like that, sort of relating them to the understood idea of, who is a scholar, who is an intellectual. Well, they look like this. And to touch on Suzanne Seesman's question about class, I think in the same question that I definitely think that the depictions of alchemists are related to class, because when you see the sort of scholarly presentation in the more well-equipped rooms and things like that, you sort of get that idea of respectability. And then then the peasants, alchemists pictured as peasants are almost universally pictured as fools. They're wasting their money. They're blowing it. They're just blowing it in every sense. And I think that's obviously a class dimension. Who has a right to scholarship? Who has a right to these kinds of investigations? Who's going to do it correctly? Is definitely a through line in this. And some of the only pictures I find that really kind of toss this aside a little bit are Cornelius Bega's pictures of alchemy. He's a Harlem painter, son of he's in a goldsmith's family. Basically, everyone in his family who isn't an artist is a goldsmith. So he's very familiar with a lot of these, metallurgical tools, depicts them with great accuracy. And he has a couple of alchemists where they're in really sort of peasant-like situations. Their rooms are really decrepit. Their clothes are tearing off, particularly. But the pictures show them engaged in real processes, making real products. And there's even a question of whether or not they're really shown as succeeding in making the Philosopher's Stone. So they're really, to me, those are really curious ones, because they overturn that common. It's usually like the scholarly alchemist is good and he's right and he's doing a good job, and the peasant alchemist is wrong and he's crazy and he's messing it all up. And the Bega pictures really complicate that. They sort of sit in the middle and complicate that a lot. So I'm very fond of them.
Well, I think that might be a nice point to end on. And I like how you ended your talk, that the sort of not always a strict line between the good and the bad, but the sort of fascinating.
It's not.
It's not. It's a messy, complicated line and process. Thank you so much again. It was really wonderful. And I invite you all, please go, if you're in Philadelphia, or go to Philadelphia to the Arthur Ross Gallery and visit the show in Inner World, which is open until July 25th. So there's still plenty of time for you to go. So have a nice day, everyone, and thank you again, Elizabeth.